Hey, thanks for joining me. So today I want to talk about how you can calibrate your internal light meter so that the need for an external light meter is minimized. Now, you notice I said minimized. You're not going to eliminate the need for a meter. There are times when a good light meter is really valuable. And so I'm not saying you should throw away your light meter or anything like that, but you can calibrate your own internal light meter so that you're able to make exposure judgments on the fly quickly and take pictures without having to stop and meter all the time. So let's first talk about exposure. What is exposure? I like to equate exposure to filling a bucket of water from a faucet. You can either turn the faucet onto a dribble and let it take a long time for the bucket to fill, or you could turn the faucet on really high and fill the bucket really fast. So the way that kind of correlates is the faucet on low with a dribble coming out for a long time is kind of like a small aperture in your lens and a long shutter speed. Turning the faucet on really high so that it's really pouring out a lot of water and filling the bucket quickly is like using a large aperture in your lens and a short shutter speed. So in the end, the end result is you have to fill the bucket. And that's kind of the way film or a digital sensor is. When the right accumulation or amount of light has reached the sensor or the film, you get a correct exposure. The trick is to fill the bucket, so to speak, all the way full without overflowing it or without underfilling it. And so the right balance of aperture and shutter speed is what does that. Now, your typical camera is going to have aperture settings. You can see these numbers here on the aperture ring. And these represent a ratio. They're actually kind of like, you might consider them like a fraction. So every lens, of course, has a focal length. This is a 58 millimeter lens. If I, just to make the numbers easier for my feeble math brain, we're just going to round down to 50 millimeter. So let's say you have a 50 millimeter lens and you set the lens at f4. What that means is that the actual hole in the lens, the aperture mechanism, that opens and closes. You can really see that opening and closing, but that diaphragm that opens and closes in the lens, there we go. The actual diameter of that hole, the aperture number is a ratio of the focal length of the lens to the diameter of that hole. So if I set my lens at f4, that means this hole is 1/4, the diameter of that hole is 1/4 the length of the focal length. So if you have a 50 millimeter lens and you have it set to f4, it's going to be 12.5 millimeters in diameter. If you have it set to f2, then it's going to be 25 millimeter in diameter, etc. So each of those numbers represents the diameter of that hole as a ratio to the focal length. The end result is that for every lens, f4 is the same amount of light. Whether you have a 28 millimeter lens or a 50 millimeter lens or 200 millimeter lens, f4 is the same amount of light transmitted through the lens. Now, the numbers also, each time you go to a bigger number, like from f5.6 to f8, you've cut the amount of light in half. So each time you go to a bigger number, it's kind of like a fraction, where an eighth is actually bigger than a 16th. When you go from f8 to f11, you've cut the amount of light in half. If I go from f5.6 to f4, I've doubled the amount of light. So you can either have or double the amount of light by going to the next increment or the next full number on your lens. Okay, the shutter speed in the camera works similarly in that the numbers you have on your shutter speed dial represent the amount of time in fractions of a second. So if you have your shutter set to, say, a eighth of a second, is that what I have set there? Kind of hard to see upside down. An eighth of a second, that's going to be twice as much time as if you go to a 15th of a second. And if you go from an eighth of a second to a quarter of a second, you've doubled the amount of time. So again, each number increment either doubles or halves the amount of light that reaches the film or sensor. So, you know, a 60th of a second is going to be twice as much light as a 1/25th of a second. But a 60th of a second is half as much light as a 30th of a second. So each number you go to a bigger number, you cut the amount of light in half. Each time you go to a lower number, you double the amount of light. So it's a balance between the lens and the shutter speed. Again, it's like filling that bucket of water. I could set a small aperture like f11 and use a longer shutter speed. So that's like pouring the water slowly through the faucet and taking a long time to fill the bucket. Or I could open up to f1.4, and you know, that would be like, you know, using a fast shutter speed. That'd be like turning the faucet on all the way and filling the bucket up quickly. Either way, I got to get the bucket full. I don't want to get it over full. I don't want it to spill over, and I don't want it to be under full. So that's basically the way exposure works. Between our aperture and our shutter speed, we're going to control the amount of light. The advantages of using one aperture or another versus a shutter speed or another, you know, that's probably another video, but just to very briefly put that together, what you're looking at is wide apertures are typically used to reduce depth of field so you can have those soft blurry backgrounds like for portraiture, and fast shutter speeds are typically preferred for things like action, like sports or wildlife, where you need to freeze action. So that's kind of the way exposure works. Now, we've all heard about the sunny 16 rule, right? Where in bright sunlight on a sunny day, you set the shutter speed to the number that's closest to the film speed that you're using. So if I'm using, let's say, a film that's ISO 400, I would use a 500th of a second at f16, and that's going to be a correct exposure on a bright sunny day. I'm in Oklahoma, and I can tell you that's mostly accurate in the summertime when the sun's up high, pretty accurate. Wintertime, even in midday, that could be more like f11 and a half, maybe even f11 in the deepest part of winter. So you really kind of have to meter your own area to know. But the sunny 16 rule really will get you a usable exposure with using color or black and white negative film, regardless. So there's enough latitude in the film to cover it. Now, it's real important that you learn common places where you photograph. So when I was in high school, I was using a Minolta SR1, just like this one. It wasn't this particular one, but it was just like it, same lens. It was a camera my dad had given me, and I became the de facto yearbook photographer my freshman year of high school because I took journalism 1, and the teacher learned my dad was a photographer, and so I basically took almost all the like student life yearbook pictures. I didn't do the portraits, and a whole bunch of newspaper pictures, and I ran around the school all year until the yearbook went to bed just taking pictures. I hardly did any schoolwork. But in doing all that, my dad had given me a little Vivitar handheld light meter. I quickly learned I didn't have time to meter every shot. I had to learn, the lighting conditions in different places. Of course, I knew the sunny f16 rule. I learned that in classrooms in my school with 8-foot ceilings, they're white with fluorescent lighting, I could shoot a 30th at f2.8, or a 60th at f2, and I could get exposures that were accurate. In the hallways that weren't quite as bright, I'd have to open up a stop, so I'd have to go to like a 30th at 2 or a 30th at f2 or 60th wide open, something like that to get a good hallway exposure. I've learned over time what lighting is like in my home, depending on what lights are on and whether there's sunlight coming in through the windows. The best way to do this is to use a light meter or your camera that has a meter and to, go around and look at these exposures and document them and write them down. So I learned over time that things like concerts, though the audience is pretty dark, the stage is really bright. And so some of those things can be a little hard to judge, but I learned how to shoot concerts without a light meter. I've shot concerts with the SR1, and I did an Aerosmith concert in the late 70s. I was on the front row. All I had was that SR1, and got some great pictures of the Aerosmith band, and didn't have a light meter, but learned to judge the exposures. If you like going to museums, initially you're going to have to take a light meter to these places, or a camera that has a light meter. But what I recommend is either using your phone and a note app in your phone, or get a notepad and start writing down these different conditions and what the exposures are. You can take around a light meter, or you can use a light meter app in your phone. I like this. It's not super sensitive under low light, but this little Gaussian Pilot is cool. It uses a selenium cell, so it doesn't require batteries. I can use it for reflected, or I can use it for incident metering. Reflected metering means I'm aiming it at the subject, and it's seeing whatever light bounces off my subject, or reflected metering. Incident metering is where I put this diffuser in front of it and I aim it at the light source. So if I'm outside, I'm aiming it at more or less, well, kind of halfway between the ground and the sun is what I typically do. But I aim it at the light source, and it tells me how much light is reaching my subject, and I can meter that. So that's the way this Minolta meter works, unless I put the reflected attachment on here. This you aim this at the light source, and it tells you what the exposure is going to be. So, it's real helpful if you will go around, even if you're not taking pictures, if you have a small light meter, go around and, you see a scene, you're curious, what does open shade look like? That's typically 4 or 5 stops you have to open up from bright sunlight for open shade. What does a cloudy day look like? What does cloudy bright conditions? Used to be film would come with a cheat sheet that, every box of film had a sheet inside of it that the ones today just have, it's actually printed on the inside of the box now. You don't even get this is 120 film, but you have to take the box apart to get to the information inside. But it used to be the boxes of film came with, well, this one doesn't even want to come apart. But used to be boxes of film would come with a cheat sheet, a paper sheet that you could, not only get your development time and all that stuff, but it also had a cheat sheet that would tell you, bright sunlight conditions, sand or snow, cloudy bright, cloudy conditions, indoor conditions. It would give you a cheat sheet that gave you information on what kind of exposures to use. We don't really, and even some cameras, my Rolleicord has that on the back of the camera, on the back door of the camera. We don't have that so much today, but you can kind of make your own. Like I say, I use a note app in my phone, and when I meter something that's a little uncommon, I'll make a note in the app. I try to update those notes so that if I take some pictures using those notes and maybe they're under or overexposed, I'll make some adjustments to those set notes, and then next time I try again, I'll see if it improves. But it's not hard over time to train your eyes to judge exposure based on common situations, but also just on the general brightness of the light. After you've done this a little bit, you'll get to where you can look at a scene and you'll be able to make a determination on exposure that's, in a lot of cases, in most cases, close enough that'll be within the latitude of your film. You'll be able to get a picture. Over time, this will improve, and the more you do it, the better you will get at it. And so that's definitely a skill that you can learn. Now, I recommend starting with one ISO. So if you shoot a lot of ISO 400 film, learn all of it on ISO 400. You can easily convert to other ISOs. So if you grab a roll of ISO 100 film, you need 2 extra stops of exposure, because it's, 400 to 200 is one stop, 200 to 100 is another stop. So you would need 2 stops of additional exposure in order to get the correct exposure. So learn it all on one ISO. Based on the film you shoot, use the most common ISO that you work with, and then just basically adjust your settings for whatever film you're using. So that's really all it is using a light meter or the meter in your camera. Keep in mind that your digital camera has ISO settings, and the ISO is an international standard. The ISO 400 in your digital camera is the same thing as ISO 400 on film. And if you use your digital camera and make note of the exposures as you take pictures, again, either use a note app or write them down in a notebook if that works for you. I think the practice of putting notes on paper or in an app like that helps you remember them, just, kind of like the way professors make you take notes about stuff. So take notes, refer to those notes, make adjustments to those notes. And if you keep doing this over time, it won't be long before you'll be able to go out with your film camera and really not worry about a meter. I mean, there'll be times when you'll get fooled, and there'll be times when you'll need to maybe make some adjustments. But it's all a learning process, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. Train your brain. You can calibrate your eyes to be a very good light meter, and just takes a little bit of time and practice, but you have to do it intentionally. You have to really think about what's the lighting like here, what's the exposure, document that, learn from it, refer back to those notes, use those exposures, memorize them over time, and pretty soon you'll find yourself looking at a scene and going, oh, it's sunny out, but this is open shade, so I need to do this. Or it's cloudy out, and it's cloudy, but it's not super dark, so here's what I'm going to do. And you'll be able to get, again, with the latitude of black and white or color negative film, you'll be able to get certainly close enough to get a picture. And the more you do it, you'll get to where you could even probably do it with, like Ektachrome or transparency film and still get a good exposure. So anyway, I hope you'll give that a try. If you have any suggestions on how to do this or thoughts or questions, please don't hesitate to leave me a comment. I always love hearing from you. And as always, thanks for watching.